Lessons Learned is next on our agenda today, and leading that conversation will be AURI's Dr. Michael Studelberg. He leads and manages AURI's Analytical and Byproducts Laboratory. He provides support in chemical technologies and processing of value-added agricultural products, and he will be introducing the people who are going to be in his conversation. Did anybody show up, Dr. Studelberg?
I think everyone is maybe a little shy from coming down from the last session with all the questions asked. But, and Margaret? But, there we go. But we have Tony Cordelette. He's a weed scientist from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and supervises the noxious weed and industrial hemp programs. He's over 25 years of experience working with invasive plant species research, management, and ecological preservation. We have Dr. George Weiblin of the Weiblin Lab Studies and Plant and Insect Systemics, molecular phylogenetics, population genetics, ecology, and coevolution. Dr. Weiblin is also a resident fellow of the Institute on the Environment and interdisciplinary institute that seeks solutions to Earth's most pressing environmental problems through innovative research, partnerships, and leadership development. And then Margaret Riotrowski, who has been with the Industrial Hemp program and the coordinator through the Minnesota Department of Agriculture since November 2016. And prior to joining the MDA, Margaret managed a native plant production operation and performed habitat restoration and non-native weed management. So if you can tell from our forum today, there are still a lot that we need to know, but we're here to learn to talk about what we've learned so far on industrial hemp in Minnesota. So Tony, I think we'll start with you here. Hoping you could talk a little bit about the new, the legal side on the new regulations and upcoming changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, by the way, for having me too. Obviously, I've been with hemp since 2010, and most of you know that it really was not seriously taken or even legal to grow until 2014. And a lot of you that I see, including you, George, in the room, know that when the laws were initially developed, we were talking about developing fiber for shirts and textiles and products and grain for food. And so we have a federal law, even though people refer to it as the 2018 Farm Bill and how it amended the AMA, and our 2015 Industrial Hemp Development Act that are really designed for that, okay? And the one thing I've learned, and I'll keep it short, and we can open it up to discussion, is 0.3. That's the number. Grow under that, and really you have no problems. Now, some of you are looking at me like, well, it's easy for you to say. That's the law, and that's what we're held to. I haven't been here for the whole conversation today, but just listening in on some of the last conversation, I think one of the parts of the discussion that's missing is public safety and our law enforcement entities. They hold us accountable to that number, okay? There's no leeway. There's no, oh, it's only 3.5 or it's 4.2 or, and that's our job, by the way. We didn't write the statute. We didn't design it. We're here to uphold it, and we don't take that lightly. It's tough to call somebody and tell them they're over. That really stinks because we know that you guys put a lot of money into it. But that's really the basis is we need to get, either some legislation needs to change that number or we need to find out how to get the industry to work with that number because it's not changing. I just, before I came over here, was immersed in 161 pages of federal rule, all right? Trying to figure all of that out, and then you put 50 states in there. Every one of them has a different interpretation of what the fine points of it are. We're already starting to see that. Then you take your trade organizations that support you folks, and they all have widely different, they want it to be favorable to businesses, which we understand. I think we're all looking for clarity and answers, and that's what you can see has been the difficult part. So,
George, I'm hoping you could talk a little. You've been in this area for a while now, since the early 2000s, working with MDA. I'm hoping you can talk about what you've learned on hemp in Minnesota, and maybe some of the compliance factors that you've had to deal with as well.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks to Aubrey for the opportunity to participate in the forum. I wish I'd caught more of it with my other commitments this afternoon, but my perspective is kind of an odd one to share in that I feel like a bit of a part of the fossil history of industrial hemp. Just to give you a little bit of background on how I got into it and to set some context for what I've learned up to now, Governor Jesse Ventura, he put forward a kind of a public policy position on industrial hemp and posed the question, why is it that our neighbors in Saskatchewan are growing hemp and we're importing it primarily for grain and oilseed use, and we can't do that in Minnesota. And as a young assistant professor at the university, that looked like an interesting problem to work on from a biological standpoint, knowing that there's genetic diversity in cannabis and there are genetic differences between marijuana cultivars and industrial hemp cultivars. But we couldn't tell you back in 2002 when I got into this what genes or what genetically was responsible for the variation we see in cannabinoids, THC or CBD. And that's what our work primarily focused on. We obtained a Schedule I research registration from the DEA in 2002, and the compliance requirements for having a facility where cannabis could be cultivated for research are very intense. It's meeting the specifications of a minimum security prison. And actually the university buildings lend themselves really well to that kind of modification. So with no grants, no sponsor, no industry partner, we, on the cheap, built a facility where we were able to do a very limited amount of research, and it was very slow and painful process. And at that time, I took a lot of ridicule from my colleagues as to why I was even working on this plant. Now, fast forward to where we are now, we've learned a great deal from those experiments about the inheritance of THC and CBD and what genetically, or the genetic component of that. Of course, there's an environmental component to anything in the environment, any living thing, and how it manifests itself, from a seed through to a mature plant. But there's some very striking genetic differences, and we're getting into the mechanisms of understanding that. And a lot of the motivation for the work is hopefully to provide some scientific evidence to inform the policy, because as we've seen, 0.3 is a convenient yet arbitrary number for a threshold.
Yeah, actually, someone earlier before you guys were here asked where that 0.3% number came from, so maybe you could answer that.
Yeah, I can comment on that. So there's
George created it.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I inherited it, and we inherit the number from a botanist in Canada, Ernest Small, who quantified levels of THC in plants and recognized that they're distributed differently among cultivars, and there's this kind of dip in this distribution. You have it's a two-hump camel-like distribution, and there's this dip between the drug types above 0.3 and the industrial hemp types below. But the dip doesn't go all the way to zero. You'd have to cut the camel in half to have a clean break, and that's just not the case. So it's messy. What have I learned? industrial hemp has become much more complicated now that we can no longer claim that it is not produced for drug use. We used to be able to say hemp is not a drug. That really, and because prior to interest in CBD, nobody was using industrial hemp varieties of cannabis or any other varieties of cannabis for any kind of CBD purpose. And suddenly life has become very complicated. So one of the lessons I've learned is that you cannot predict, now that this train has left the station, but this train doesn't have a track. This is more like a snake that's left the cage. Because if anybody thinks they know where this is going, the main lesson I've learned is that I never could have predicted where we're going to be right now. When I started the work pointing out that THC and CBD differ, people didn't know what I was talking about because they never heard of this thing called CBD. And so, I mean, we've heard the risk aspect to where the industry might, risks associated with industry. And I think a lot of that risk surrounds the uncertainty associated with something that is just so unpredictable, because here's this plant that produces these products that have all kinds of applications, all kinds of health implications, all kinds of societal implications. And so it's, my lesson is, just trying to stick to the evidence. We don't have enough to forecast where this thing is going.
Thank you, George. Margaret, I'm hoping you can initially talk about some of the summary of the pilot program so far, and if you have any statistics and lessons from the producers and growers in Minnesota.
Sure, I can do that. 2019, we're just wrapping up the 4th year of the pilot program. The first year was 2016. We only had 6 growers, and there were about 40 acres which were grown. And flash forward to this year, we had over 740 applicants, but that includes growers and processors. So we actually had 340, I believe, licensed growers who were actively growing. And it was about 8,000 acres. So, and just to put that in perspective from last year, from 2018, we only had just over 700 acres last year and about 45 growers. So last year, it was Tony was the supervisor and I was the only person on the program. And it was, busy, but I could go home at a reasonable hour, and I still kind of had my sanity. But basically, starting in December of 2018, like the minute the Farm Bill was signed, our phones just rang off the hook. I didn't know that our voicemail boxes could fill up. And the first time that happened, I was like, have you guys ever heard of this? Our voicemail boxes fill up. And then after that happened pretty much every other day for the whole winter. So it was just really crazy. And people have said, over the whole year, well, don't worry, it'll slow down. You guys will have some downtime. That literally has never happened. Luckily, we have Katie Muchler, who is our second person on the hemp program, and she came on in May, and that has been hugely helpful. But we still need more help. So when we were doing the field inspections this year, I believe we had about 500 fields, and they were scattered all over the state. As Commissioner Peterson said, it was like 80 out of 87 counties in Minnesota. So we actually had to pull inspectors from other regulatory programs, mainly from our seed program, but people who usually do like insect surveys, just all kinds of inspectors. We quickly trained them in, and we got them out there just as much as we could. We did about over 600 samples this year, and the failure rate, which is kind of what everybody always wants to know, was only about 7%. So out of all those 600 samples that we took, about 7% of them were over the 0.3% THC limit and were failures. So, you know, it's not bad. It's not a too terribly high number, but it's certainly more than what we'd ever want to see. And if you're one of those 7% of the people, it really sucked for you. So one of the big things I think there's a few lessons that I've heard from the growers that are very consistent. So one of them is seed genetics. So people that had failures were shocked for the most part and felt like they had been sold bad seed, they had been deceived. They were like, I don't understand how this could happen. They guaranteed that this would be good seed. It was guaranteed to be hemp. You know, there's really no guarantees in this. The hemp varieties that are bred to be high in CBD, they're actually just a few generations away from their origin, which is as marijuana varieties. And as you push that CBD level, everybody wants to have higher and higher CBD levels because that's what you actually get paid on. You get paid by the percentage of CBD that's in the flower. So they're trying to breed and push the levels up as high as they can. Well, that also will bring the THC levels up. So then it's just, you're just walking this razor's edge of like, how can we get it CBD as high as possible, but also keep under the limit. So finding good genetics and reliable companies, that's a huge issue. So we need a lot more work on that. And I'd say another major thing is people just wondering, where do I sell it? So it kind of has this allure because it, you know, it's hemp, it's kind of exotic, it's new, it's cannabis, so it's exciting, and so everyone wants to grow it. And also conventional farmers are really not making much money on corn and soybeans right now, and so they're desperate for an alternative crop. So people are wanting to grow this for a lot of different reasons, but they basically, to my mind, are approaching it from the wrong end. So first they're deciding they want to grow it, then they ask us, how do we get a license? They get the license, you know, they buy the seed, they plant it, and then they think about where they're going to sell it. And, you know, if you're a farmer, you know that's not really the way that you should go about things. Maybe it works for corn and soybeans because you always will have a buyer at your local co-op, but that's just not how hemp works. So it's kind of heartbreaking when we hear that people have a whole field of beautiful, wonderful hemp, and then they don't know where they're going to sell it. And the processing is, as we've heard all day today, it's a huge bottleneck. There just aren't enough processors in the Midwest to handle all this hemp that's being grown. Even we only have 8,000 acres. That's not I mean, it's a lot, but it's not a terribly large amount. But we don't have enough capacity to handle that right now. So those are the big things I've learned this year.
Thank you. Yeah, we're constantly learning, and Margaret, maybe or Tony, maybe we could answer the question that was asked from last session as well.
Yes, Douglas, thank you for asking that question. So you can, if you're a processor or just, you know, well, you're wondering about buying hemp for processing, right? Or for reselling?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so you can buy it from Minnesota sources or from other states where it's legally grown. Same thing is going to apply. So in Minnesota, since the MDA just regulates hemp that's grown within Minnesota, so we say if you grow hemp in Minnesota, you have to have a license to grow it, and the state has to come out and take samples and test it. And if it's shown to be below the 0.3% THC level, then we issue you a certificate. So the certificate just says we tested it and it's legal, and now you can sell it. So if you're buying hemp that was grown in Minnesota, you have to have that certificate. If you're buying, and a lot of other states do it the same way that we do, but depending on what state it's coming from, you know, maybe if it's Wisconsin, they do the exact same thing as us. So they'll have that Fit for Commerce certificate. So if you're buying Wisconsin hemp, you also have to get a certificate. If you're buying it from Oregon or Colorado, they don't test every single field there. So maybe it's a COA, a certificate of analysis, or test results from a private lab that you have to get. But you always have to have some kind of documentation showing it's legal hemp.
So yeah, I was aware of that, but I guess I was mistaken. I thought there was like when we had talked, you needed something special to be able to buy from the farmers here in Minnesota, and I was very confused on that. It was like,
No, if you're going to be processing hemp in Minnesota, you also have to have a processor license. But if you're just buying it,
reselling.
if you're reselling it and you're not changing, if you're not repackaging it or altering it or processing it in any way, then you don't need a license. So we don't issue licenses to sellers of products. So like we get that question all the time. People who are like, I have a CBD store, I want to sell CBD oil. That's not us. That's, the Board of Pharmacy, other agencies. We only license growers and processors.
Really quick, actually, question for the Department of Ag. So, whatever transpired of the talk of the Department of Ag, negotiating and facilitating like individual grower contracts with the Department of Health for the hemp, the hot hemp, since it's no longer marijuana. If it's grown under a hemp license, it's considered hot hemp. Then, right? It doesn't go back to marijuana. It's considered hot hemp according to the Farm Bill, right? Am I right?
Well, it's considered illegal, but we call it hot in the business.
Well,
yeah.
But okay, so
I
it
get what
switches
you're
back.
saying,
So
yeah.
then it's still federally illegal. Then it
Illegal,
goes back
yeah.
to being federally illegal. Okay, so
It's marijuana basically once it goes above 0.3.
so for those individual farmers, instead of losing out that 7% that was the failure rate, what about the talk about individual grower contracts with the Department of Health to utilize that in the medical marijuana program?
So the law in Minnesota for the Department of Health that just passed is specific. You see, if you read the hemp law or the Industrial Hemp Act, it just says there's a provision that allows hemp growers to sell to medical marijuana facilities. However, Department of Health has a whole set of laws that you'd have to go read, and that governs what you're talking about. There is no what I call remediation in Minnesota. So in the MDH law, it says it has to be hemp as defined. So what you just described, you'd be selling them marijuana.
That's federally. It says specifically there'll be no criminal on the grower if it's.
It's not, if there's no criminal charge to you, it's called a negligent violation, but you can't sell it to the Department of Health has two manufacturers under their guise, and that's it. And they can only buy hemp. They can't buy anything that's not hemp, and hemp is defined as 0.3% or less. So if it's hot hemp, like what you're calling it, that's actually marijuana by
Dr.
definition.
Studelberg, are you ready for other questions, or you got something? Okay, George, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of want to pick up on this question specifically as it relates to producers of industrial hemp, farmers, because it's something follows up on something that Margaret said, and one of the kind of interesting lessons that you alluded to is the fact that those who are buyers of CBD for processing to produce some CBD product are not interested in buying conventional certified industrial hemp seed because the total quantity of CBD in those traditional fiber and oilseed varieties is low. And the breeding of, we've learned that the breeding of these high CBD plants that risk dragging THC along with it, they are derived from the interbreeding of hemp and marijuana genetics. So there is a history of marijuana genetics in these high CBD strains, and it's the buyers of CBD-rich flowers that want to extract oils that determine the market for farmers who are growing those, who want to grow that crop. And unfortunately, for the farmer, and this is true in lots of areas of agriculture, most of the risk is borne by the farmer. And so anyone who's thinking about getting into this without first having a business plan and truly understanding the risks of failure it's going to be really, it's really unfortunate. As you said, it stinks to get that call that, hey, you wanted to grow for CBD. Well, you could get somebody promising you the best high CBD genetics out there, and you could still fail because there's marijuana genetic ancestry in those plants. And that's not something that the CBD industry wants to promote or talk about. And it frustrates me as someone who's been trying to work on these perhaps less valuable, but very important industrial uses of hemp to see folks claiming that their products are 100% hemp when they're 100% hemp and they're 100% legal when they're not. The folks who have been trying to develop the supply chain for things like fiber hemp, we have a hard time getting decent seed prices now because all the interest in CBD has driven the seed prices up for some of these really good fiber strains. So that's a lesson, I think, in and of itself.
Yeah, let me take that just quickly one step further, because the lessons learned here from the regulation side, and I think George hit on it, the biggest issue we deal with, hands down, you guys all know the industry's growing, you're all smart people, you're doing really innovative things, that's going to continue. The biggest thing is buying your source genetics, because that is where the regulation's going to come in, and you're not being told the truth by seed companies around the country where you're getting seed from. If you were a corn farmer and you bought seed from Pioneer that was told to give you yields at whatever and it didn't, you'd be disgusted at the price you paid for it. You folks as growers, and I'm assuming I'm looking at a lot of growers here, you need to drive this. You need to expect more out of the genetics you get, because that's the only way it's going to change. And that is the single most important lesson I've learned, is that it is on the farmer. And if you read the new Farm Bill rules, the USDA even specifies they are not ready to start a certification program for seed because there is no such thing. And so you're hearing Colorado say, oh no, we got certified seed. By what standard? Somebody just said it's certified. Okay. And you're going to buy it because you've been used to buying certified seed under AOSCA and other agreed upon standards. No. That doesn't exist right now. It does for fiber and grain. It doesn't for CBD varieties.
If I could, real quick, thank you, and I apologize for asking too many questions. I'm just close to the microphone here. So are you published, Dr. Wiblin, on some of the findings that you've had? And
Yeah,
you are published?
Yes.
Okay.
The work on the genetics of CBD production, we published a paper in 2015 that was the first paper to propose the gene that's responsible for the ratio of THC to CBD.
Okay.
And that work has been independently verified by some other researchers.
Is it on your website?
Yeah.
Can we find it?
Yeah,
there?
yeah.
Just Google you, or you'll find it.
Yeah. Google my name; you'll come. And then the other thing is, last October we published a preprint, which is not a peer-reviewed scientific article, but it's sort of in the process toward being peer-review published. We published a preprint on the cannabis genome, and that also has some additional findings in it about the inheritance of cannabinoids. There's also another research study going on at the University of Minnesota that I should mention to growers, in case you are aware of feral cannabis on or around your properties. There's a project in the Department of Horticulture that is looking for those localities to study the old genetics of the fiber hemp that was grown in Minnesota. So please look me up and shoot me an email, or contact Colin Jones at the University of Minnesota.
Thanks. My final question, from an enforcement side, I've been doing awfully a lot of, the learning curve is vertical, and a lot of Google, a lot of videos. I've seen some videos where processors said, okay, we got this CBD crude oil here, it's at about 7%, now we got to dilute it down. If we purchase product from these people, are we are we committing a felony because they're beyond? How does a
Yes.
processor? Well, but they dilute it. They're suggesting the
So
dilution.
it goes back to right now, a matter of fact, the legislature this last session has directed the Department of Ag to meet with Department of Public Safety and Health to come up with a framework of how that would be regulated. And our first meeting is next week. It's mostly going to be the law enforcement side that are going to be weighing in. I don't really know where Department of Health, although they'll have someone from Office of Medical Cannabis there. What we're hoping to do is come up with some way to help the processing where we know that it goes high, you're concentrating the, no pun intended, the THC, and then you're diluting back. The problem is that if you want to sell crude, which is the popular product, and you want to sell it out of Minnesota, whatever the legislature, Minnesota legislature would act on, it would only be for in the borders of Minnesota. Once it leaves, you know, then it's subject to federal law. So at least it would be a step forward. We would have a way in Minnesota for you as a processor to be following some guidelines that even, right. But if you want to buy it, then you'd have to, there'll have to be some framework where you're going to either dilute it back or you're, you know, if you're just a middle person, that's one thing, but if you're going to make product out of it or possess it, how are you going to bring it back into compliance?
Okay, we've got 2
You can
minutes
talk to
left.
me.
2 minutes left, and 3 questions lined up. So we'll take those 3. We'll start back there.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. I think this is mostly for Tony and Margaret. Could you speak to any experiences you've had as you've been out in the field involved in testing and speaking with growers about perhaps the wisdom of investing in private testing as the crop matures to make sure that your harvest date is aligned with where you think the CBD content is, maybe as a best practice?
Yeah, well, a lot of people don't even realize that they should be doing their own testing, and that's kind of a big message that I would always really try to convey. So the state test, that's the test. That's the official regulatory test. I mean, and we, you know, when a state inspector has to come out and take the samples and send it to our lab, and that's the regulatory test to prove if it's hemp or marijuana. But we don't test for CBD at all. So a lot of people were just waiting until they got the state results back to know what their content was going to be so they could market their crop. And we don't. All we look at is THC. So that's one reason why someone would need to get their own testing done. I really think that if you're going to grow it, you should just budget to have regular testing as part of the process. I think people don't like to do that because it's expensive, but that's just part of raising hemp at this point for CBD. So I think they should be testing weekly or every other week from the beginning of flowering so that, you know, even if the first test comes back and it's 0, okay, well, you know, you're good, right? You're okay right now. But you can just be really carefully monitoring it, and you can see trends. So you can really say like, oh, the THC levels are starting to accelerate faster than I thought they would. So I'm probably gonna have to harvest maybe a week or 2 before that I thought I would. And so the department will need to come out a little bit earlier. And it's just, knowledge is always better. I mean, that's just the worst thing to happen is like for you to not even have any clue what your levels are, and then the state comes out and it fails. I mean, then there's nothing you can do at that point. And I think like for a first-time grower, you have no idea how this variety is gonna operate here. You've never grown it before, so you should really be gathering lots of good data. And maybe if you grow it for a few years in a row and you get a good handle for how it's gonna perform, maybe then you can back off the testing a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of what my 2 cents is.
We've done some testing at AURI, and we've seen that trend too. So if you want, you can come talk to me afterwards too. But I think we're out of time. Dan, do you have? Yeah, well, 2 more.
Okay, I was down in Altoona, Iowa, September 17th for 600 people at a hemp conference, and the point was made, Tony, that THC elevations were too much nitrogen was put on at one time, elevated the plant. You've seen the same thing? Okay. And then a comment, I'm an agricultural plant, soil, and animal nutritionist, prevention, soils, organic, blah, blah, blah. The excitement that AURI and the possibility of getting this approved as a livestock is the answer for me to us that this level that exceeds, and I don't want to put any undue pressure on processors, but we have all these 10, 12 different processes without getting into it, that couldn't the processors be the ones that could dilute and control this so that the farmer doesn't have to destroy it in that middle ground and give it to cows, sows, chickens, and cats that can't drive?
Yeah, again, you know, you're asking the wrong people. We're not setting the policy, so you'd have to. I think that's where it needs, and I think it's wide open to change policy, but that needs to be done. Otherwise, we got to follow what we're given, because law enforcement at the end of the day are also dealing with some nefarious characters that are taking advantage of it.
What would it take for the state of Minnesota to get ahead of the curve with Crop Improvement Association and certification with public varieties?
Boy, that's a good question. We've worked at Fawad Shah at Crop Improvement has been part of the discussion since the hemp law in Minnesota passed in the 2014 Farm Bill. We've had a few grow outs of certified varieties. It's been more for grain varieties. A couple people have done that, and I'm expecting there will be more. I think the CBD issue is still hard because and I may be missing the question here, but the varieties are just not as stable right now to even start what they would call foundation seed or whatever. So you're kind of starting with a risky proposition. But I think Crop Improvement's willing to take that on, and I would like to see more involvement with them. So,
Dr. Studelberg?
I think we're out of time here. Thank you, everyone. We always have more to learn, and we'll be sure to pass on any knowledge that we have here from AURI as well.
Last word from AURI Executive Director Shannon Schlecht.
Hey, thanks, Dan. First of all, let's thank all of our panelists. And I also want to take this moment to thank all of our AURI staff that pulled this together. If we can give them a round of applause and all the work that they've done. So a couple of closing comments. I think we heard a lot of great information here today, and there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of bottlenecks, but there's a lot of opportunity. All right, and I think Steve maybe said it best in terms of this is going to be a collaborative effort in terms of how we all work together and move this forward. We've got associations that are formed here in Minnesota to help move the needle. We've got a very I think a good rapport with the Department of Agriculture, with the legislature, right? The USDA guidelines that we can put input into, right, to really shape this and help advance some opportunities. With that, I also want to note that AURI is in the process of forming an emerging crops roundtable. And you'll be hearing more about that from the AURI as well. But we're looking at like all these new opportunities, and there's all these challenges that we've heard about today with industrial hemp. And how do we look at coming together collaboratively around opportunities that we see for evergreen crops, for example, like Kernza, like camelina, pennycress, I think even alfalfa with some new uses. How can we all come together and collaboratively start to move the needle on some of these other economic opportunities that may be beneficial to the Minnesota agricultural industry? So look for information from that. We'll probably be doing 2 events in 2020 around that. And with that, I want to thank everyone again. There's a reception with AgriGrowth that Tamara mentioned earlier at Britt's Pub, just about a block and a half down the street if you want to continue discussion over libations. Otherwise, thank you all, and there'll be some networking out front as well for furthering